I believe the best way to preserve history is to continue to share stories from the past. You see, I was lucky enough that I actually got to spend a lot of time with my great grandfather, who was born in the year 1900, and he lived to be 98 years old. And during this time, he bestowed upon me a lot of stories from the past and growing up in a different time. So I wanted to share those stories and keep that history alive. Now, this first story comes at the time when we start to see the first Model T, cars coming about. And his father and his family lived north of Milwaukee in Wisconsin. Now, his father or himself had never experienced a car, but his father had heard about them and he wanted to get his first vehicle. So he ordered a vehicle, and a salesman actually brought the vehicle out to their farm. And the salesman proceeded to tell him, this is how you work this vehicle. But his father was a stubborn man, and he said, no, I don't need your help. I can do it myself. Just get out of here. And he sent this salesman away before he could teach him how to actually drive a car. So he gets behind this Model T car, and he starts tinkering around with it. And finally, he discovers how to get it moving forward. So it starts going. And when it comes time for him to stop this vehicle, he grabs on the steering wheel and pulls back and says, whoa, 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 like it was a horse, because he was so used to pulling on the reins of a horse. He actually thought this was a horse. And so he ripped the steering wheel actually off the car and crashed into a fence. And he said he could still remember it like it was yesterday, about his father's first experience with a car, because up until then it was all horses and horse buggies and horse-drawn carriages. And that was his first encounter with a vehicle. Another story my grandfather told me of when he was a young child. His home actually was heated by a wood-burning stove. And so one day, his father sent him and his brothers out to go out into the woods, chop wood, and bring it home for the stove. So they set out and went deep into the woods, and they started chopping wood with their axes. However, it started to get late, and rather than go home, they didn't feel they had enough wood that would be sufficient to keep their home heated for a while. So they continued chopping wood, and all of a sudden, this is northern Wisconsin where you have wolves. They started hearing wolves howling around them in the woods. And them being young boys, they started to get terrified. And they said they could start to see the wolves kind of walking back and forth between the wood line, and they could see them moving through the woods. And so they took off running as fast as they could. And these wolves chased them over to a lake where thankfully they found a boat. And they were able to flip this boat over on top of them and take shelter kind of from the wolves under this boat. However, the wolves started digging underneath the boat, and when they finally, kind of got through, they would reach their paw in, and the only thing that my great-grandfather and his brothers could do was take the axes that they had and chop at their paws, and this kept them out. And they said for several hours they were fighting with these wolves to keep them from eating them, because they probably would have ate them had they got a hold of them. And so he said, that was the time when he was really terrified, because he never, seen these wild animals, and when you think about how, we don't really see wild animals like that, or have experiences like that much anymore. but he actually encountered wild wolves in northern Wisconsin. Now, this next story is kind of maybe more a tall tale. I don't exactly know, but I find it very interesting. And this goes back to the Civil War. And now, like I said, my great-grandfather, his uncles were in the Civil War. And one of his uncles told him this story about his regiment that was encamped somewhere outside of Richmond, Virginia. And they had this camp out in the middle of the woods, and it was late at night. They had fires going. They were eating dinner, when all of a sudden they started hearing these like very loud screams, and they said they almost sounded like someone being attacked. And then they heard these weird vocalizations like growls coming from the woods, and they thought that maybe these were the Confederate armies coming and sneaking up on them. So they got prepared and they grabbed their muskets, and all of a sudden, they could hear stuff moving around their camp, and they could hear vocalizations, and stuff started getting thrown at them like sticks and rocks. And that's when they could see in the shadow these very tall men, they said, 9 to 10 feet tall, moving around the campsite, kind of encircling the campsite. And they were completely terrified about what was happening. They had no clue as to what was actually going on, and they began firing at them. And they said this battle kind of ensued for several hours throughout the night, where they were fighting this unseen kind of enemy, which they had no idea exactly who they were. The only details they had was they could tell that they were very tall, and that they looked like maybe they had some sort of fur coat on, or they were covered in fur. They could not tell what they were. They called them sort of wild men. And they said this ensued overnight, and then it sort of just like that, as it had started, they just left. And they searched sort of through the woods the next day in that area, and they found all these very large footprints that were bigger than a human's footprint. And he said that his uncle, when he tried to tell, his commanders, the people, his superior officers or whatnot, that they said, you must be you guys must have been suffering from shell shock and the effects of war. Is just making you see things. They didn't believe them that this had actually happened, and they really didn't try to pursue it or anything. But he said that his uncle would always tell this story about this strange encounter he had fighting in the Civil War. And I thought that was pretty interesting. But I'm going to tell more stories, but I figured I'd give you a couple stories. And I also have some very neat stories that I learned from my great-grandfather. Not my great-grandfather, sorry, my great-uncle, who fought in World War II. And some of the other relatives who shared with me these stories, and I did my best to try and remember them, because in my family we felt like these stories kept history alive and kept history going, and these were important to remember. So I wanted to share these stories with you because I thought that was very important. So thank you for watching. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe.